Hello everyone and welcome to our Mountain Lake PBS Community Forum. Tonight we welcome New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who represents the 21st Congressional District that covers 12 counties across northern New York, from Lake Champlain all the way to Lake Ontario. We have invited 100 people to be part of our studio audience who will for the next hour have the opportunity to ask the Congresswoman questions. If you are watching our live stream, you can also send in questions and comments to our website, Facebook page, and Twitter using the hashtag Stefanik Forum. We chose our audience by lottery, and that's also how we will determine the order of questions. But before we begin, let's welcome Congresswoman Stefanik, who will kick things off tonight with a few words. Congresswoman?
Thank you, Tom, and I want to thank all the participants for coming today, for being involved in the civic process. I also want to thank all of our viewers who are tuning in either on TV or are watching the live stream. I'd love to have you follow up with my office if you have additional questions. I am truly honored to serve as your member of Congress. I proudly started my second term this past January, and I've been focused on being your voice in Washington, focusing on economic growth and job creation for the North Country, advocating on behalf of our veterans and military families, and bringing an independent common sense perspective when it comes to representing our district. I know there's a lot of questions on people's minds, and I know that many people particularly want to hear about health care. So I'm looking forward to answering those questions and having a respectful give and take. And I want to spend as much time as possible hearing from you, so I will stop there and turn it back over to Tom.
All right, and we will turn it over to you folks. We are going to take 3 questions from the studio audience and then take a question from online from the folks watching our live stream. So let's begin with our studio questions. Number 47, come on up to the microphone. You are first. Welcome. Tell us who you are and where you're from, if you would.
Good evening, Congresswoman. My name is Carol Solari-Rusco, and I live in the town of Peru. I'd like to provide a comment and then ask the question.
Sure.
Congress has voted to defund Planned Parenthood. This means that Congress wants to block Medicaid patients from going to Planned Parenthood health centers, which would force or could force these health centers to close. This would affect over 12,000 men and women in the North Country who rely on Planned Parenthood for high-quality, affordable family planning and reproductive health care, including birth control, sexually transmitted disease testing and treatment, and mammograms. This is my question. Planned Parenthood provides care to 2.5 million people in this country nationwide. Why did you vote to prevent people from going to the health care provider of their choice, and in particular, one which is a primary source of health care for several North Country counties in your district?
Thank you for the question, and I've had the opportunity to visit with many groups of women to discuss the importance of investing in women's health care. I voted to redirect funding towards federally qualified health center. We have a number of those in this district, and it actually increased the funding on top of what we are currently allocating for women's health. My position, and I know there are heartfelt disagreements on this position, I'm personally pro-life with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. I'm very respectful for those that have differing viewpoints, but my vote was to redirect and increase that funding to federally qualified health centers.
Of which Planned Parenthood is not one.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am, for the question.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Next, welcome.
Hi, sir.
Steve Lobin from Lake George.
Steve.
I want to thank Mountain Lake PBS and Congresswoman Elise Stefanik for this opportunity to make a comment and pose my question. In March, I sent a letter to you with my expression of concerns about your position on the then taking shape of the replacement to the Affordable Care Act. I then sent a follow-up letter to that letter, receiving no response in April. Then I made a phone call requesting that I get a call in response to the 2 letters sent. I very much welcome this opportunity this evening. I'm still looking for answers, but I'll pose just one this evening. I'm extremely disappointed in the lack of responsiveness to my concerns, which took considerable time and tried to represent in a factual way. To find what was accomplished with the replacement, supposedly, of the Affordable Care Act, falling so far short of that initiative in spite of its difficulties and needs for improvement. Specifically, when none of physicians' associations, nurses, hospitals, the whole run of health service providers are all saying this is not good. It is not in service to people. And what it translates to by those individuals who address this issue with expertise without a political orientation to their perspective is wealth, those with wealth, the wealthiest of us, get the tax break, and a big one. Those of us who are aging, instead of the first formal structure to the bill that was taking shape where we as seniors would pay 3 times what younger people will to drop the premiums. Then it went to 4, then it went to 5. Now, with what you have voted in support of, with Medicaid reductions, it will reduce or eliminate valuable services to the most needy of our district. And it also will eliminate or reduce health supports that began in 1997 for children who are, if not below the poverty line, are just above it. This, to me, is a travesty. So here's my question to you. In the news this morning, the GOP senators are saying they're not going to deal with the bill that you have passed. They're going to do their own thing. And they cite several things that are shortcomings in what you have voted to put in place on our behalf. My question to you is, at any point in time, did you contemplate not voting for the bill because it fell short in any way? And so I'm interested in your identifying, if you're able to and willing to, 3 things that would improve what you approved in the bill as it stands, in that senators, GOP senators, are saying they're not even going to consider the bill. Thank you.
Great question. I know there's probably a lot of healthcare questions this evening. So first, I want to address your contact with my office. My office strives to get back in 2 weeks or less when it comes to correspondence. We have seen a significant increase, not only from constituents, but from people across the country writing in. I will personally follow up on your specific letter and make sure that I get the turnaround time from my staff so we can address that, because absolutely there should have been a response, and I'll check to make sure that there was one. On the content of the healthcare bill, when I ran for Congress in 2014, I talked about the need for better healthcare. We've seen increases in costs, we've seen increases in premiums and copays as a result of the Affordable Care Act, as a result of the implementation of Obamacare. My own personal experience, my family's small business had our health care coverage canceled as a result of the Affordable Care Act, and the new plan was more expensive and was not as good as the old plan. I myself am on Obamacare. So there are 3 important, you asked for 3 issues. I want to talk about 3 important issues I fought for in the negotiations. First, I think it's important that our district have a seat at the table. I'm only starting my 2nd term, but I was able to get 3 provisions in the healthcare bill that I think are really important. The first one is not allowing members of Congress to be exempt. We should be held to the same standards as everybody else. That's why I'm on Obamacare, because we need to live by the same laws that we passed. So I co-authored an amendment that was in the final bill, and it actually passed unanimously by both Democrats and Republicans to make sure that members of Congress aren't exempt from the replacement. The second issue that I fought for, which is really important to me, is making sure that our young mothers have the support they need for maternity coverage. So I authored an amendment to add $15 billion to support those who need access to maternity care. And the third issue is looking at the fact that New York State is the only state in the country that pushes the Medicaid costs down to the counties, making sure that Albany is taking responsibility for their budgeting. When it comes to improvements, this is the first part of a legislative process, and I've worked with the Senate numerous times, whether it's been on the House Armed Services Committee or with the mental health bill that we passed in the last Congress. I think they can work on providing better support for states that have expanded Medicaid, which New York, of course, is one of those, and there are a number of Republican senators from Ohio, from West Virginia, from Maine, who have talked about the importance of increasing that support. I'm absolutely look forward to working with them on that. I also think that the tax credit issue, in New York State, you talked about the age rating. We actually have a 1-to-1 age rating, so you're not rated by your age in New York State. So that would not impact this district. It may be an issue in other states. I think that 1-to-1 rating is a good model across the country, and I'm hopeful that that's an area that we can improve. And then I think, you know, one additional opportunity is trying to get some bipartisan support. I talk about being a bipartisan member, and I'm hopeful that senators like Joe Donnelly, Joe Manchin, and Claire McCaskill and others are willing to work to keep what's working, young people on their parents' plan until the age of 26, making sure that we're providing very strong coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. But yes, we will be working with the Senate and move forward. But thanks for the question.
Thank you,
You're
Steve.
you're very welcome. I really appreciate your response. You need not, though, follow up with what I was presenting to you for your consideration. The vote's been taken. It's a matter of record. But I will watch with great interest when the Senate goes to work to see where you land in relationship to party loyalty versus the 21st District. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Our next question, welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for meeting with us tonight. I'm Greta Heilman from Mountain Lake. And one thing I'd just like to mention is it oftentimes ends up sounding like you voluntarily use Obamacare, but it's my understanding that all Congress members are required to sign up under the ACA. Last week, you and your Republican comrades cheered and celebrated while millions of Americans watched, many of us scared about losing health care for ourselves and our families and loved ones. This is a bill that was denounced by every major medical association, the AARP, and more. This is a bill that was pushed through without a CBO report. I came and talked to you about health care, the fact that the ACA had given my parents health insurance for the first time in 20 years, and me for the first time since I was 18 years old. The fact that I was previously a pre-existing condition during my pregnancy and went through most of my pregnancy without any insurance or care. I have talked to many constituents in your district, and many of us are in similar situations. Approximately 64,000 are estimated to lose coverage in your district under this bill. How exactly did you give a voice to all of us constituents?
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming today. It's great to follow up with you. I know we had the opportunity to visit in my office and for me to hear your viewpoints in a setting with a small group of people, so it's great to be with you again. I think we deserve better health care. I think as we've seen prices increase on the exchange, that's of concern to me. I also think as we see health insurers leaving exchanges across the country, we need to do better. I also think that the fact that physicians are choosing not to accept health care under the health care that's on the exchange, that's of concern to me as well. So while there are physician organizations that have come against, the associations have come out against the bill, I have heard from a number of doctors and patients in the district who want more patient-centered choices. I think people should be given the same flexibility as small businesses, the same tax incentives to purchase health care insurance for a plan that works for them. And members of Congress are not required to be on Obamacare. That's something that I specifically made the decision to do. And that was a pledge I made to voters when I first ran for office. So I've seen what's working, and I've also seen what's not working with the prices increasing and the high deductibles. I'm not sure if it was in your group meeting or in a different meeting. This was in Plattsburgh. It was with a group of women. Ages ranged from high school to seniors, and we were talking about the Affordable Care Act. And I asked the group how many people are on the ACA, and one hand went up in the group. And I said, well, tell me, I want to hear from you what's working, what's not. And she talked about the high deductible and how she couldn't access the care because that high deductible she couldn't afford to pay out of pocket. That's of concern to me, and I think we need to have better plans and better choices that truly provide the coverage. So lowering those costs so that it's more accessible. But thanks again for asking the question.
We're now going to go to Jen Kowalczyk, our communications director, who is watching what's trending online. Jen?
So this is a question that came in from Lori Davis earlier on Facebook and says, Ms. Stefanik has stated that with the Medicaid being cut by $880 billion in the reform health care bill, she is confident that over the next 3 years that private insurance companies will help out to offer affordable health care to those that need it. How will people with disabilities whose services will be cut be helped when Medicaid is cut this severely? Thanks.
Sure, so I want to address some of the misinformation that's out there. The proposal regarding Medicaid has to do with the Medicaid expansion population. As I mentioned, the Medicaid expansion, certain states chose to expand Medicaid, other states chose not to. New York is a state that chose to expand Medicaid, and I advocated for a 3-year process so that New York can ensure that it's continuing to provide coverage. So states are still allowed to serve the Medicaid expansion population, but it's a decision that a state can make, and their federal dollar match will go to the traditional 50-50 versus the 90% and 10%. So I actually think that this modernizes Medicaid. It gives states the flexibility to focus on the most vulnerable and the most needy population, individuals with disabilities. But it's a really important question, and there's been a lot of misinformation shared on that. Thanks.
I should have drawn numbers before I went to Jen. I'll learn as we go on for the next hour. Let's draw the next 3 numbers of folks to get them up here. Number 36, number 54, and number 1. So 36, 54, 1. If you folks want to come on up, we'll.
Good evening.
Hi.
My name's Charlie Finkel. I live out in Morrisonville.
Hold on just a second if we would, Charlie.
Sure.
We're going to get your mic stand.
How's this?
There you go.
Good to see you
Good to see
in
you
this
too.
forum. I'm going to switch gears a minute. It's a 2-part question. Do you believe that the wall is going to be built with Mexican funds? And if you do, how are they going to pay for it? And if they don't, we're going to pay for it. And isn't that a hell of a burden to put on taxpayers? Couldn't that money be better spent someplace else? Like health care? That's a lot of money.
Well, thanks for the question.
Sure.
I've always said that when I disagree with the president, I would say so. I think it's not going to happen, that Mexico is going to pay for the wall. That's an area where I disagree with him. I don't think that's realistic. I do support increased border security, but as I've talked to many of my colleagues who represent parts of the southern border, you have mountain ranges, you also have water, you have very diverse topography along the border, so I don't think a wall is the best model. I think you can use technology, you can use increased border patrol, but I do think we need to get serious about border security on the southern border. What I think is important in this district is we need to remember that we're a border district as well, and the northern border is very different than the challenges on the southern border. We have tremendous amount of trade, of services, products, people crossing our border on a daily basis, and we have a great working relationship with our Canadian counterparts. I've had the opportunity to tour many of whether it's the Port of Champlain or Ogdensburg, to get a briefing on how well they work together. So this is an area where, while I agree that we need increased focus on border security, I don't think the President's plan is exactly right on this.
You know this is going to come up again in September, this question.
This will come up again actually before that as part of the appropriations process, because we're going to be working through appropriations bills. The government funding bill that we just passed, that passed with bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, with many Democrats and many Republicans voting for it, actually did increase border security funding, but it wasn't specifically allocated towards a wall. So I do think that's a more common sense approach.
You know the President's going to push for the wall.
Well, you know, there are areas where I disagree with the President on. And
How about your colleagues?
And many of
in the House?
One of my colleagues, who represents actually the largest part of the southern border, vehemently disagrees with the President's plan, and he's a Republican. His name is Will Hurd. He's a common sense centrist member, and I think there are voices. You know, we live in a government that has separation of powers, and Congress has the power of the purse, and we control the appropriations process. So I do think you'll see independent voices.
Good.
Thank you, Charlie.
Good.
Appreciate it. Welcome. If you could
Hi.
tell us who you are and where you're from.
Yes, I'm Sarah Carpenter. I'm from Queensbury, New York, and Representative Stefanik, we met once before in a private meeting in early March. My husband has leukemia. He's been on chemo since 2014 for nearly 3 years. His chemo, as you know, has been a real miracle for us at saving his life. With it, he works full-time, pays taxes. He supports our family. He's helping to raise our daughter, who you met. And he loves his grown sons and their growing families. But without this medicine, he'll be dead in less than a year. The problem is this. His chemo costs $11,100 a month, every month, for the rest of his life, unless they find a cure. $11,100. Of course, we're very grateful for the medicine, and we're especially grateful to have good health insurance right now. In fact, our health insurance covers most of Bob's medicines. They've already paid $250,000 to keep my husband well. The $11,100 cost of my husband's chemo is not because of R&D, and it's not because of FDA regulations or even manufacturing costs. We talked about this when we met. The reason it costs so much is because it is the only medicine that will save my husband's life. His doctors know it, we know it, his insurance company knows it, and this is important. The drug company that makes it knows it. They know that without this medicine, my husband will die. They know the choice is pay or die. It's extortion. And every other new cancer drug is priced the same way, $80,000 to $150,000 a year. If you watch the nightly news, you'll see the advertisements, and I would challenge you to look up the price of any of the new cancer medicines. Representative Stefanik, I have a two-part question. The first part is, what will you do to give us more leverage to negotiate a reasonable price for life-saving medicines? The second part, and this one applies to you, is will you sponsor a bill that will prohibit elected officials who accept campaign money from pharmaceutical companies, starting today, from voting on any health care legislation?
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your story with such a large group and the audience on TV. We did have a very heartfelt and it was a very meaningful meeting to me to meet your husband, but also meet your young daughter, who, as you said to me, wouldn't have a father today if you didn't have access to the medication that he needs to continue on his life. We did talk about, and I want to share with this group, the fact that I actually think this is an opportunity for bipartisan agreement, looking at how our drug pricing is structured in this country. This is actually an area where the president has reached out to Democrats across the aisle to see whether drug companies can negotiate directly with the government. I think another way to address drug prices are investing in NIH funding, National Institute of Health Research and Development. That's incredibly important research, and it helps us get access to these life-saving medications faster. We had an increase in NIH funding, and I signed on to every single letter advocating for that increase. Additionally, we passed the 21st Century Cures Act last year, which reforms the way the FDA approves drugs that are legal in this country. And I think it does need to be modernized so that we can get cures to patients faster, whether it's for cancer, whether it's for Alzheimer's. And these are diseases that impact everybody. Raise your hand if you know someone or have someone in your family who has been diagnosed with cancer. Every hand in this audience is going to go up. And when it comes to campaign finance, I think transparency is key. I think that any donation, whether it's to an independent expenditure or a super PAC or a candidate, needs to be shared with the public, transparent, listed publicly. Some states do that, and we need to do better as a nation to ensure that there's transparency there so people have an understanding of who's supporting different candidates and campaigns. But thank you for sharing the story.
So with all due respect, my husband's medicine is already approved, and it was fast-tracked through the FDA. Mm-hmm. And as I shared with you when we met, there were tens, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars of NIH funding that helped contribute to this. But if it is unaffordable, it means nothing. So my question is, what will you do to give us more leverage to negotiate a reasonable price for life-saving medicines? And will you sponsor a bill that will prohibit, not just transparency, but will prohibit an elected official who accepts pharmaceutical company money from voting on healthcare issues?
Sure, so again, the first question, I think the way we can lower prices is in continuing to invest in NIH. I think that's critical. You talk about the importance there. And also being open to discussions on a bipartisan basis to allow the government to negotiate with drug prices. I think that would help lower the cost. You and I had talked about that proposal.
I think that would help.
And I think that there's bipartisan interest in that. And I'm engaged in those discussions. And I think this is an area where the president is reaching across the aisle to engage in those discussions. When it comes to the last proposal, I'm always willing to look at draft legislation and consider it and get further feedback from the district.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
You're next, sir. Would you like some water?
Oh, no, I was looking to make sure we're drawing so everybody has a chance. Okay. Hi, sir.
Hi. That's a tough one to follow. She needs our prayers and good luck. Good luck. Congresswoman? My name's Sam Burns. I'm from Ogdensburg, along the shores of the overflowing St. Lawrence River. As a member of the Board of Directors of the Ogdensburg Bridge and Port Authority, thank you for everything you've already done for economic development in our part of St. Lawrence County. As you know, Congresswoman, our international bridge has over 1.5 million crossings per year, providing the Ogdensburg Bridge and Port Authority income of over $2 million each year. However, our bridge is over 60 years old and needs an estimated $130 million to make necessary repairs before it becomes a real problem. Now, as you know, and everyone else here, the bridge connects the capital of Canada to the shortest route to the United States. It is an economic engine for our region. I guess my question is, will you help us?
Absolutely. I've had the opportunity to visit many times to the Ogdensburg Bridge and Port Authority and have been a strong advocate, whether it was for the airports, and it was so exciting to be there for the first flight from the route back and forth to Florida, I believe it was.
Yes.
I also have had the opportunity to see some of the new manufacturing businesses that you've been able to attract in some of the warehouse space. MedEng is a great example of a cutting-edge business, and it's a Canadian-owned company that's opened up and is employing New Yorkers. When it comes to the bridge, I've had the opportunity to sit down with your executive director and look at the pictures myself of the peeling paint, which is not only an infrastructure hazard, but it's a hazard environmentally. And I absolutely think infrastructure funding is a must in terms of economic development. And if you think back to earlier this year when the president delivered his first joint session of Congress, he talked about the need for a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And that was an area where both Democrats and Republicans stood up and applauded. And I think it's a real opportunity to get targeted funding towards projects like OBPA to ensure that infrastructure is not only our roadways, but our bridges, our waterways, our sewer, and rural broadband in a district like this. So you can continue to count on my support. I know the bridge is a priority for OBPA, but I know it's also critical for not just northern New York, but the Northeast, frankly, in terms of economic commerce and continue to have that flow. To grow our economy and create jobs locally. So thank you for being involved with that organization, for serving on the board, and thank you for making the trip to this today.
Thank you. Should I wait for the check or?
We're working on it. We're working on the infrastructure bill.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to draw the next three numbers and then we'll go to Jen to see what's trending online. You folks have a chance to walk up to the mic while Jen's doing the next question. Number 12. Number 22. And number 17. 12, 22, 17. If you want to make your way to the mic, we'll now check in with Jen Kowalczyk to see what's trending. Jen?
Hi, this came from Laura on Twitter just a few minutes ago. Laura would like to know, are you willing to push for an independent investigation into Trump's Russia ties? Nunez is too close to Trump and Congress is fumbling.
It's a very timely question. I actually serve on the House Intelligence Committee. I didn't in my first term, but I was one of the 3 new members appointed to the House Intelligence Committee. We are conducting a bipartisan investigation, and I know there were some concerns weeks ago with the direction it was moving. Chairman Nunez has actually recused himself, which I think was the right decision, and it is now being led by Chairman Conaway, who is a member from Texas who heads the Agriculture Committee and has been on Intel for a long time. The Republicans and Democrats have agreed to a bipartisan set of witnesses, which is great, and I am involved, as you saw during the open hearing we had with the FBI Director, Director Comey, and the head of the NSA, Admiral Rogers. I asked very fact-based questions about when the FBI decided to open up a counterintelligence investigation, making sure that the FBI director told Congress, and I had concerns about the lack of process. My questions are fact-based, and I want to follow the facts wherever they lead.
Thank you. Our next audience member. Welcome.
Hello, my name is Nina Matto, and I live in Westport, New York. I have a question and a comment about a previous answer that you gave. You stated that federal funds should only go to federally qualified health centers rather than Planned Parenthood. We live in a very rural district. If a low-income person here in Plattsburgh needs to find one of these centers, they need to either take a ferry to Vermont or drive 20 miles to Champlain if they have a car. If a person lives in Saranac Lake, they have to drive 35 to 40 miles to find a federally qualified health center. Defunding Planned Parenthood does not really reflect the low-income needs of people in our district. Now to my real question. The president said people with pre-existing conditions will be covered in the new health care bill. However, there are several loopholes. If a coverage lapses for 63 days, higher premiums can be charged, which could prohibit low-income people from being able to get insurance. Statistics show that low-income people tend to go off and on insurance frequently as their economic situation changes. Also, the MacArthur Amendment allows states to opt out. They must provide coverage in high-risk pools, but there's no cap on the premium insurance companies may charge people with pre-existing conditions such as heart disease, cancer, diabetes, arthritis. The pool of money that's been added to defray these costs is nowhere near what is needed. I am a breast cancer survivor. I'm a high-risk pool. According to the estimates from CBS Money Watch, I could be charged anywhere from $28,000 to $78,000 per year in insurance premiums, depending on where I live. Can you explain how this constitutes better health care at lower premiums as promised?
Thank you for asking the question. I know this is on many families' minds in this district. I think that any replacement should provide coverage and protections for those with pre-existing conditions. And there is language in the American Health Care Act that explicitly prohibits insurers from not accepting patients that have pre-existing conditions. It also doesn't allow them to increase prices and charge an individual more if they have pre-existing conditions.
No, not according to the MacArthur Amendment.
You can go to passthebill.gop and read the actual text, because that was an important provision to include that. When it comes to the MacArthur Amendment, a state will apply for funding. They have to demonstrate that they're providing coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. Some states have been able to do this effectively through high-risk insurance pools, like Maine, for example. So they would have to apply for a waiver. It would be a very limited number of states. I certainly don't think New York would be one of the states that would do that. So the $8 billion, that's for a very narrow number of states. That's on top of the $130 billion in the base bill. So yes, the bill has language that explicitly provides coverage for individuals with pre-existing conditions. You can't deny coverage for individuals with pre-existing conditions. You also can't increase costs of insurance for individuals with pre-existing conditions. So I would love to continue talking about this in my office, but I hope you would go to look at the text in the bill that specifically does not allow insurers to charge an individual more if they have pre-existing conditions or to deny coverage.
If they opt out in the MacArthur Amendment, though, they're not subject to those requirements anymore. They can set their own standards and their own premiums.
It's a great follow-up, though, because states have to demonstrate in order to get approved for the waiver that they adequately provide coverage for the population with pre-existing conditions. And states have done that effectively before through insurance pools managed by the state.
Nina, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, welcome.
I'm Catherine Kramer. I live in Westport, New York, and although I have not met you before, I've met with a young man in your Plattsburgh office a couple of times who's a very nice guy. On the other hand, in terms of actual written correspondence, I have had somewhat the same experience as the gentleman who spoke earlier in terms of not getting any kind of cognitive response after much detailed submission of information. In January of 2016, on January 1st, I had corporate health care through my husband, who worked at the Macmillan Publishing Company, and I had for 18 years. On January 21st, my husband fell down the stairs and hit his head and died. And by January 31st, my family had no health insurance because the insurance ended at the calendar month. We were offered COBRA by the company for $2,100 a month, which I did not have at that time. I was scheduled for February 17th for brain surgery, to have an egg yolk-sized tumor right about here removed. I was very frightened. I met with somebody from the Adirondack Health Institute who did guide me through the complicated ACA situation and discovered that I was eligible for the essential plan. And I did on March 28th of that year have brain surgery, and my family was on the essential plan. I just gave them the numbers again because it was time to re-up, and somewhat to my surprise, they put me on Medicaid, so I've been on Medicaid for all of a week. I'm looking at the situation, and I hear what you're saying about the high-risk pools and the pre-existing conditions, et cetera, but what you're saying does not accord with what I've been able to find online. As nearly as I can tell, as somebody who has to have my brain imaged by a CAT scan or MRI every 6 months or a year for the rest of my life, I had just better never get off Medicaid, which essentially locks me out of the job market from age 55 to 65, as nearly as I can tell. Now, maybe you guys haven't explained things very well, but as nearly as I can tell, that is the case. I've looked at what are my alternatives other than health insurance, and the answer seems to be have really a lot of money or move to Sweden. How are you going to help people in your district? I am by no means in the worst situation. My brain surgery was a success. I am healthy. I just have a very high checkup thing that's going to go on forever. How are you going to help people in your district to get through situations like this and worse?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Catherine, for being here today. I actually see sometimes you tweet me, so I'm glad to meet you in person. I'm so sorry to hear about the tragic story of your husband, and thanks for having the courage to share that with this group today, as others have as they've come forward. My goal is for better quality healthcare and lower costs, because when you lower those costs for the appointments, for different procedures, you're more likely to have patients go in and seek the preventative care they need. So you talk about the importance of checkups, which is absolutely critical for an individual like yourself who's faced these health challenges and has had severe surgery. Many people aren't going to those follow-ups because the cost out of pocket under current plans is so expensive that they can't pay it. So I think we need to have better healthcare, more choices with lower costs. I also think when it comes to the Medicaid population, making sure that we get rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse within Medicaid, and actually make sure that the funding goes towards patients who need it. So the most vulnerable, the disabled population, people below the poverty line. That's where we need to focus our Medicaid dollars, and I think we need to do that effectively. But as this legislation moves forward, this is an opportunity to work with the Senate, as the gentleman who came before earlier talked about some of the Senate's proposals that they've been discussing. I need to hear from you about ways we can improve, particularly given your personal experience, how I should be working with senators on issues like this.
Well, I mean, I guess the thing that could have been improved most is making it understandable what your coverage options were. I'm a very smart person. I'm very used to looking stuff up on the internet, but I had to have somebody advise me, and I was very surprised what my options are. The coverage under the essential plan is very low cost. And I gather the coverage under Medicaid, which I just went to my first appointment on it, is even lower cost. So the cost wasn't the issue. It was the complexity of it and exactly what do I do that would kick me off this that was the difficulty that made me anxious. But I'm very grateful that the essential plan covered $104,000 of medical care costs for me in 2016. But I just don't know whether I'm ever going to be allowed to get a job if you guys are put through the plan that you got. I just don't know.
And I think we need to have a model when it comes to healthcare where people see a path off of Medicaid so that they're not concerned about if they get a job, they're going to be kicked off of Medicaid. We need to ensure that there are options that are out there. And when it comes to the transparency of cost, I think no matter where you are on Obamacare, what your positions are, we need to have more transparency in what health procedures, what the actual cost is. Because you have to ask explicitly hospitals to give you the line by line on the invoice so you can see the cost at the end of the day. You get different responses for getting your tonsils out from different doctors. I think we need to have some streamlined transparency when it comes to procedures that happen on a daily basis in hospitals like CVPH and Adirondack Health.
Catherine, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you. My name is Mary Ward, and I have a lot of questions and comments, but I really want to respond to a comment that was made previously and then to ask a question. You just voted to decimate millions of dollars of Medicaid. And I'm wondering, this is just a brief question, what is the fraud and abuse that you're talking about? I work with low-income families and many working poor families every day for the past 35 years. Those people are not abusing Medicaid. They are working, and many of them have been able to, through our previous administration's very hard-fought battle, gotten good health care coverage. What is the abuse that you're talking about? And why did you decide to reduce the amount of Medicaid? And then I have a question for you, but I want to follow up.
So that first question regarding the Medicaid, what is included in this bill deals with the Medicaid expansion population, and it has a 3-year process by which states that have expanded Medicaid can choose to continue doing that, but the state will have to pick up the traditional 50-50% rather than the 90 to 10% federal match. So it really has to do with the Medicaid expansion population so that we can reallocate the funds towards traditional Medicaid. When
I
it comes
heard
to
you say that earlier.
Right.
So what are the fraud? What's the fraud and abuse?
In New York, there have been studies. We pay more per recipient of Medicaid than California, Texas, and Florida combined. I think some of the administrative costs are especially high in New York, and there have been instances of serious abuse. I think Medicaid dollars should be going to the patients, making sure that it's providing the coverage for the patients you talked about. That should be the priority. The vulnerable population, the population that absolutely needs that safety net, rather than some of the wasteful spending. We have waste in every agency.
Okay. Okay, and you also were just talking about the itemized bills, the high cost that hospitals charge. So let me ask a question. You have said in the past that you would never vote for a single-payer healthcare system. The CBO reports, and it sounded like you just said, no, I won't, without any discussion. The CBO reports that you have received over $32,000 from the health insurance industry for your campaign. So I can see why you would reject even the thought of a discussion about the single-payer system. I would like to remind you and your colleagues that there's plenty of evidence to support that a lot of these problems could be solved if we had a single healthcare system. No, let me finish. I would like to remind you that this single-payer system is working in democratic countries as well as right here in our own country. That is Medicare. It's a single-payer system. It's funded by our tax dollars. It is funded by the people. And it's run by the government, which we depend on our government to run things for us. And it's working well for the American people. Now, there is some trouble financing Medicare, but guess what? If we change the way that we tax wealthy families, the way that we cap people who are receiving Social Security once their income, if their income is over $250,000, if we change the way we tax people, that wouldn't be an issue. What do you say to that?
So this is an area that I've heard from a lot of constituents on, and I disagree with Senator Sanders that single payer is the best solution, and let me tell you why. In our district, we have the highest number of veterans out of any other congressional district in New York State. And on a weekly basis, since I've taken office, the number one issue that I hear from constituents on is problems with the VA. Claims with the VA that are going unanswered, backlog. We've been able to claim over $1.5 million of VA claims for vets just in the 21st Congressional District. And there's more to come. That number keeps going up. So my concern when you have a government-run healthcare, we've seen it hasn't worked when it comes to VA. And I do think the long-term...
Then fix it.
I think the long-term solvency.
Then fix it. Don't throw the whole idea out because there's one segment that it hasn't worked for. Medicare works. Fix that.
I appreciate your perspective, but I also take very seriously the experience that I hear from veterans that this system is not working.
How about the experience that you hear from the rest of us? Of course we want our veterans to have good health care. But we want good health care too.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
All right, we're going to draw the next three before we go to Jen online. 43, 30, and 18. 43, 30, 18. And we'll come to you folks in just a minute. Jen, let's hear what's trending online.
This question came from Beth Ashworth on Twitter, who explains that her spouse is a farmer and his premium costs will go from to $14,000 per year out of a $30,000 salary, and would like you to explain why the rich are getting a tax break and not farmers.
So again, the goal of reforming healthcare is to lower cost and improve quality and access. So my hope is that we're going to have a more flexible marketplace that will bring down costs so that it's actually more affordable than plans that are on the exchange. Plans that are on the Obamacare exchange continue to increase in prices by double digits, and that's been a concern that I've heard from many farmers, from many small businesses, and from many individual families in the district.
We have about...
Respectfully, you didn't answer the question about why the rich are getting tax breaks. That was the question she read off.
Sure. So
Sorry,
it is true, Obamacare increased taxes on Americans across the board on cost of health care. So there were...
Okay, folks,
So our
let's keep this
legislation...
in
Our
check,
legislation repeals the Obamacare taxes, whether it's the medical device tax, the tax on high-quality healthcare plans. We repeal the health insurance tax. That will help lower costs over the long run. I believe in lowering taxes, lowering the tax burden on individuals and families in this district.
you didn't answer the question. What about the welfare?
Next, please. Folks, please.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Megan Niemeyer Green. I live in Chateauguay, not too far from here. So thank you for coming. I appreciate you coming and speaking to us. I've actually had a similar experience. Both myself and my two young sons wrote letters to your office in February and have yet to receive a response. Speaking of my sons, they're 5 and 7. I told them that I was coming here to meet with you tonight, and I said, boys, what would you like me to ask the Congresswoman? Because they are the future of this district and this country. And without hesitation, they both said our environment. My 5-year-old has been fascinated with recycling centers and landfills for a very long time. And my older son, who is 7, has a love for animals that I have really never seen, especially reptiles, lucky me. And my younger son is concerned about drinking water and pollution in the air. And my older son is concerned about the extinction of animals. I know that you have some experience with climate change policy and working bipartisan with climate change, but my question to you is, what do you plan to do to convince your colleagues that climate change is not a theory, it's real? The data shows it's real. I'm concerned for my sons. You know, I'm a teacher, I'm a high school teacher. I work with millennials every day. They care about climate change. We need to care about climate change for them. You are in a position of power to help them. So what is your plan to convince your colleagues that we need to do something about climate change?
Great question. I'm glad this issue came up in this forum. I introduced legislation, and it's actually Republican-led, forcing members to put their name on legislation that acknowledges climate change, the human role in climate change, and the need for a solution. And the numbers of my colleagues that are co-sponsoring that, we just got a new co-sponsor this past week. We have 19 and perhaps 20 current co-sponsors, and I'm working to build that into a coalition. And the reason why that legislation is important, as issues like the budget come up and EPA, that is a coalition that we can work with to fight back against cuts to the EPA. I've already come out against the president's budget where there was significant cuts to EPA, which would have had impacts on programs specifically in this district, programs to combat invasive species, the Lake Champlain Basin program, other anti-acid rain programs within the Adirondacks. So I have introduced legislation. It's the Stefanik climate change bill. And I'm talking to my colleagues on a regular basis. Additionally, you talk about how I'm communicating with fellow Republicans. I'm also communicating across the aisle. I'm part of the bipartisan climate caucus group that meets to discuss how we can work together in both parties to come up with common sense solutions. And it's really important for a district like this when the environment is so tied to our economy. I think the strength of our environment actually helps strengthen our economy with tourism and recreation, fishing, skiing, you name it, in New York's 21st district. So it's a really important question, and I think it crosses party lines. And I think the more youthful members of Congress you have, honestly, I think we're going to be able to reach across the partisan divide and solve this issue.
If I could follow up, sure. I don't really hear of Democratic congresspeople or Democratic senators deny climate change. There have been a number of Republican, including our president, who has come forward and said climate change is a hoax. It is not man-made. It is not exacerbated by man-made activities, and the data shows otherwise. And if we cannot rely on scientific research and scientific data, why are we encouraging kids to go into STEAM and STEM programs? You know what I mean? So I appreciate and I thank you for talking to your GOP colleagues about climate change. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Welcome to you, Representative Stefanik. Thanks for coming to Plattsburgh to face the music, as it were. My name's Harry Cook, and I'm from Peru, New York. And right before this meeting, I came from a meeting for my son's individualized service plan. He's a young adult with a pervasive developmental disorder and receives services through the state-funded Medicaid, and also, obviously, his health insurance with Medicaid and Medicare. You voted to cut Medicaid by $880 billion. Now, you're saying that's just for the Medicaid expansion states, but that translates into $8.6 billion to New York State, and that will cut services dramatically to your constituents. At the same time, there has been a massive redistribution of funds to the upper 2% of the earning population of this country. So is this really an economic shell game, or is it just really wanting to, cut services to people who are receiving Medicaid services? I'm very concerned that my son's plans and services are going to cut dramatically. In fact, they will be if your bill would be enacted as it is, since New York State will lose about $8.6 billion.
So again, the Medicaid proposal in the bill would not go into effect until 2020. New York can continue to expand the Medicaid expansion program until that date, at which point it would go to the traditional Medicaid match, and it wouldn't get the 90% to 10% matching.
That would be a cut.
So that is more flexibility, I think, for the states to determine how they provide services.
That is a cut to the services in New York State because it's an enormous financial cut. There's no other way around it. You can't put a spin on it.
Again, our proposal wants to ensure that we are strengthening Medicaid with a focus on the vulnerable, the poor, and the disabled population. And mental health is also an issue that we have made significant legislative progress on actually in the last Congress, with Republicans leading the effort and getting President Obama to sign mental health legislation.
Most mental health services are funded with Medicaid, as are most substance abuse services. And then you know about the opioid addiction issues in the North Country. Most of those services are paid for by Medicaid, and those services will go away. It's just not, you can't spin out that this cuts in funding are not going to happen.
There are no cuts to traditional Medicaid under this plan. Again, it just deals with the post-2020 Medicaid expansion population where they can't choose to expand more. So if you're qualified under the program, your coverage will still be there. Again, as we move forward in this legislative process, I did say that this is one of the areas I look forward to working with the senators on, who also represent states that have expanded their Medicaid coverage. And I think there is an opportunity to strengthen that coverage.
If you're going from a 90-10 cost share to a 50-50, there's a loss of money.
It's going to the traditional model, which was initially part of Medicaid when Medicaid was initially put into place. So ensuring that it's the traditional match program.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harry.
All right, welcome.
Thank you. My name is Kathy Recchia, and I live in Jay. And first of all, I want to thank you, Congresswoman Stefanik, for engaging with us tonight. I have a comment and a question, but I also kind of have adapted things as the conversation has gone on. I do want to say that I know there are some veterans outside who would probably disagree with what you said earlier about the program. Okay. My husband and I moved to the North Country 25 years ago. We started a small business and are largely self-employed and have been all these years. Health insurance has been our single largest expense over the decades, with premiums prior to the passage of the ACA reaching a peak of more than $1,200 a month. My son was born with a hole in his heart, so our family has lived with a pre-existing condition for 22 years. Sam has never had a health problem, but has a need to be examined by a specialist regularly. Should he have problems, and if his work should require him to move to another state, thanks to your vote this past Friday, our family could very well go bankrupt. Sam went to Keene Central School. Next week, he will graduate from Columbia University. He has often brought up your Harvard education to us and has hopes that the knowledge that you acquired there will ultimately take precedence over your connection with the elites that you came in contact with there, as well as your political sphere. He is especially concerned about the future of the planet, and I think he will be somewhat relieved to hear that there is a Stefanik climate change bill. That will be a surprise and a relief for him. So my question is this. You say that you want to hear from us, and I assume we'll listen to what we say, and there's certainly been a lot of conversation tonight. So given that so many of your constituents are struggling and disagree with the vote that you cast on health care, how can you guarantee to us here this evening that in all future votes you make, you will always put the interests and needs of ordinary North Country working families first, and not the interests of the top 1%, the multinational corporations, and other elites that you've come in contact with at Harvard and in all the time you've spent and are currently spending in Washington? Thank you.
I want to congratulate your son on his academic achievement. I wish him luck. And thank you for talking about your family's experience as small business owners, particularly with a child who had a heart condition. My job is to represent my constituents, and there are areas where I disagree with my colleagues, and I have a very independent voting record. There was a think tank, it was the Lugar Institute, that did an assessment of all members of Congress at the end of last year, and out of 535, the 435 House members and then the 100 senators, I ranked 21st for the most independent record. That's the top 5% of members of Congress, and I'm proud of that independent record on issues where I've reached across the aisle and shown bipartisan leadership. And I will continue doing that, particularly when it comes to continuing the legislative process with health care, which is why at the beginning of this discussion, I look forward to working with the Senate, and then when it comes back to the House, improving the legislation. On issues of the environment, you know, the Post-Star actually wrote about how the single issue where I differ with my party is on environmental issues. That was in the local paper here, and I've worked hard to build relationships with various environmental organizations, Citizens Climate Action Lobby Group, the Nature Conservancy, Save the River, the Adirondack Association of Towns and Villages, the Lake George Fund, the Lake Champlain Basin, and many more. So I hope many of my colleagues on my side of the aisle continue understanding the importance of protecting our environment.
Thank you. I appreciate the environmental concerns, but I do have to say that I'm very disappointed with how you voted on Friday. And if you are truly concerned about doing things like lowering costs for appointments and procedures, I'd like to see your plan on how you are going to do that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, Congresswoman Stefanik. Thank you very much, WCFE, for hosting this event. Thank you so much for coming out and being with us tonight. I've expressed my disappointment about your vote on Friday in other venues, so we'll set that aside. However, when it comes to the vital issue of climate change, your conclusions about how to best represent your constituents' interests diverge from that of your party's leadership. And in spite of considerable political risks, you have consistently and publicly continued to act on our behalf. Actions have included being one of the initial co-sponsors of the conservative Environmental Conservation Resolution in the fall of 2015, something that took a full year of essentially secret preparation before it could be submitted, and that you reintroduced that as House Resolution 195, now called the Republican Climate Resolution, last March. You also joined the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus in January, as you mentioned, and you're also a co-sponsor of the Climate Solutions Commission Act. Please share your thoughts about the possible future for meaningful climate change legislation in the 115th Congress, and I encourage you to just be open-ended.
Sure. So, you know, my goal when I reintroduced it was the Gibson resolution in the last Congress, led by Republicans, acknowledging the importance of climate change and combating climate change and the call for finding a solution. My goal was getting the same number, at least, of original co-sponsors as we had in the last session. And the reason why that was important to me is I want to show progress on this issue among Republicans. And we successfully did that before I reintroduced it earlier this year. I think the big issue that's going to come immediately are some of the proposals coming out of the administration. The budget cuts, as I mentioned, is a real first test for environmental voices within the Congress. And many of us, I know, have already committed to voting against the president's budget when it comes to the slashing of the EPA funding. Then we will have an opportunity to pass appropriations bills to make sure that important programs that combat invasive species, that are supporting renewable energy sources, get funded. What I'm doing is I'm an advocate for wind and solar tax credits. I'm also an advocate for biomass, which is another important renewable that has a growth opportunity in our district. And I voted across party lines. I worked with Democrats to defeat some not good amendments when it comes to renewable energy sources having contracts with the federal government. As you know, we discussed in many of our meetings the bill that was introduced in the House Armed Services Committee to not allow any military installation to go into a contract with renewable energy source. That is a bad idea. We ought to be supporting renewables, and in this district, Fort Drum actually has a biomass facility that's energy independent, energy secure, so it was a win for jobs in the district, but it was a win for our environment as well. I think those small opportunities, they seem small, but they make a big impact in showing that there is bipartisan support for comprehensive solutions when it comes to protecting our environment.
Really appreciate your support for the scientific aspects of EPA and its importance for monitoring. Thank you for your service. Thank you very much.
Next question, unless you want to continue. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Evan George. I'm from Westport, New York. And I want to go back to something you talked a little bit about earlier, which was separation of powers. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is because it seems to me that this Republican-led Congress is abdicating their responsibility to be an actual check on this president's authority. And you and the Republican Party seem to have thrown your lot in with a xenophobic and misogynistic president. And that's terrifying to a lot of us. And my understanding is that there have been about 7 opportunities for you to sign on to a bill that would force this president to release his taxes to the public. And you haven't done that. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to say that you would sign legislation that would require this president to release his taxes to the American public.
I called for the president to release his taxes when I was running. I've led on this issue. I've released my own taxes. You can see them on my website. Not most members. Most members of Congress do not do that. I believe in transparency, and I've led by transparency. I continue to believe the president should release his taxes. I think anyone who runs for president should release their taxes. I think it's an important part of running for the highest office of the land. The procedural votes have been, the Democrats have proposed stopping all of the other work that's happening in Congress to procedurally pursue this issue, and I've referred it to the Committee of Jurisdiction, which has oversight over transparency issues when it comes to taxes. Again, to your broader point, I have differed with the president on a number of issues. I am an independent voice for this district, and both when I was running and since the election, there are areas where I've disagreed with the president, and I'll list a few of them for you tonight. One, the transparency issue when it comes to his taxes. Disagree? He should release them, absolutely. He should have done it before the election. Number 2, I disagree with the White House's decision not to release the public visitor logs. I list my public schedule on my website, and you can see it on stefanik.house.gov of my official schedule and who I'm meeting with in my office. Additionally, I post every single vote on Facebook. So even though you may disagree, which it sounds like there's some disagreement here, people have the opportunity to weigh in on every single vote. I also post the votes in advance. On substantive issues, I've disagreed with the president on his executive order when it comes to the immigration executive order that came out earlier this year. I've also disagreed with him on his statements regarding NATO, which he has since shifted and understood the importance of that alliance. He is a non-traditional president. I think many of us never anticipated how this last election would go, including myself. But look at the outcome in this district. President Trump won this district by 11 points. So it's important for me to hear this, but it's also important to continue to listen to friends and neighbors in this district because people were frustrated with the status quo, and he certainly is shaking things up. One thing that will not change, whether it's President Obama or President Trump, is I believe in the role of Congress when it comes to appropriating and when it comes to passing legislation. The same criticism I had for President Obama, that he circumvented Congress to pass things through executive order, to put things in law through executive order, I've criticized this president for, and I'll continue saying so when I disagree.
Would you vote for a tax cut that came across your desk not knowing the impact or the potential benefit that it would have for the president? Would you continue to vote for his budget plan and his tax cut, not knowing how it will affect him and
He should release his
enrich him?
taxes. 100% he should release his taxes. I've said that. I will continue saying that.
You haven't.
I've stated numerous times that I believe he should release his taxes. Again, this is an issue area where I've led, and my opponents in my races, some of them have refused to release their taxes. This is an issue where I've led. I will continue to lead. I believe in transparency, and I believe he should release his taxes. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question.
My name is Manon Prevost-Mullane, and I'm from Jay. International relations is a passion of mine, and I have long worked in international exchanges for the purpose of understanding our world and global citizenship. I find that in the last year, there is less understanding and decreased tolerance. What are you doing to address this hate? And rather than closing our doors to those in need, refugees and immigrants, as well as the LGBT community and those of different religious affiliations, what are you doing actively?
So I think in my role, part of the job of being an effective member of Congress is leading by example in terms of your rhetoric and your inclusivity. I am an advocate for diversity and individuals from non-traditional backgrounds feeling comfortable sharing their thoughts with me, and that's how my office functions. And I've also spoken out when I disagree with rhetoric from some of my colleagues. And I think we need to think very clearly, particularly as elected officials and role models, how we communicate and how we lead by example. When it comes to foreign policy and national security, I believe that one of the most important things the United States can do on a global stage is building alliances, particularly with regional partners in the Middle East, for example, to pursue greater stability. And I think that's an important part of my work on the Armed Services Committee.
Was your question asking about the travel ban in particular, or?
No, actually, I was asking what you're doing actively in this. I was mentioning this region in particular. What are you doing to help our region? Because there is increased hate crimes.
So I go to high schools. I'm on the education committee, and in high schools, oftentimes I get questions regarding bullying, and I try to speak from experience and talk about how bullying should never be okay, and you should never be able to bully someone based upon their background, based upon their religion. I believe in non-discrimination. I think that's what makes our country great, in the sense that we can respect and we are peers with others who come from different backgrounds. So again, I try to lead by example, whether it's in the classroom or when I'm speaking to young students, or whether it's on the floor of Congress.
And is there any plan, excluding the travel ban going on, any plans to help this community expand? We do have a multicultural area here, but we don't see it. It's almost invisible. And this is something that I believe very strongly, that if you don't see it, you don't understand it.
So I think you bring up a good point. The solutions are not going to be in Washington on that issue. The solutions are going to be in our local communities, and there are local community groups that many of them have started over the past couple of months that are trying to answer these specific questions. They're very regionalized. There's different organizations that are pulling together. Some are through their churches, some are through their community service organizations, some are just communities and friends and neighbors that come together. I think most of those solutions happen at the local level, and that's the beauty of this district, is you have 184 towns and villages that are coming up with different ways to provide venues to foster that conversation and communication, with the goal of respect for one another.
Okay, I would like to see you at those local events, because we are far apart. In Jay, we don't have a large community center. Mm-hmm. We don't have a lot of those opportunities. So we need someone, like our representative, to bring us together. However, I don't know how, but there's something that we need to bring us together, because we're a rural community. We don't have those opportunities, and we need you to lead in that regard.
Thank you.
Would you like to continue on or say a few words?
I'll say a few words at the end. I'll say a few words at the end.
All right, at this point, we're going to ask the Congresswoman to wrap things up with a few words.
First of all, thank you everyone for the respect and for the questions. I think this give and take is an important part of our democracy, and it's certainly important for me to hear your feedback. And I'm really proud that in our district we can have a productive conversation. You're seeing some of the video clips from across the country where there's not a respectful back and forth. So I'm always very proud in our community that we're able to do that. This is a televised town hall, so it's had a great opportunity for people to tune in. And it's only one way that I'm able to elicit feedback from you, which is most important. I also host telephone town halls in addition to coffees with your Congresswoman. I just had my 15th 2 weeks ago. These are open forums advertised in advance, and I hope you will sign up for future notifications about Coffees with Your Congresswoman at my website, stefanik.house.gov. And I hope you will subscribe to my weekly newsletter that we send out via email to talk about what I'm doing the week and the next week's votes and what I'll be doing in the district. So thank you again for the great questions on healthcare, the environment, national security issues, immigration issues, border issues. We covered a lot today. And if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to any of my offices in the district. Thank you very much. And thank you to Tom and Mountain Lake PBS for hosting this event and giving the opportunity to so many members of our community.
Congresswoman, thank you very much for being here. Thank you to our studio audience and also to you at home and for joining us. For all of us here at Mountain Lake PBS, I'm Tom Halleck. Thanks for watching and have a good night. Thank you. Appreciate you coming in.